Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Changing Same, British Black Artists and Visual Arts Organizations in the Midlands event, the book launch, and also Roundtable. This is an opportunity for myself and also my colleague, Paul Goodwin, to present some of the work we've been doing in the last 2 years under the title, The Role of Visual Arts Organizations in the British Black Arts Movement in the Midlands. My name is Carolina Rito. I am a professor of creative practice research at the Center for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University. And as I said, I am today joined by my colleague, Paul Goodwin, who also co-developed this project with me. I will briefly introduce Paul now, who will join us also shortly as part of this introduction. So Paul Goodwin is professor and chair of contemporary art and urbanism and director of the Research Center for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, and also known as TRAIN at University of the Arts London. Goodwin's research and curatorial interests span the fields of transnational art, urbanism, and curatorial practice, with a focus on African diaspora art and visual cultures. You'll find the link as well in the chat box shortly with Paul's profile. Just before I continue, a few housekeeping notes. As you've noted, this presentation is being recorded, and also your microphones, I believe, were muted, and also cameras off, but there will be 2 opportunities that we would like to invite you to join the conversation. And so on that occasion, if you want to join with comments and questions, please raise your digital hands and we will be able, so our colleagues working behind the scenes will be able to unmute you. Obviously, if you don't feel comfortable or not feeling like doing so, you can also share your comments in the Q&A box. As some of you know, this event was meant to be in person, and because we sent the invitation actually for still an in-person event, but we had to make the difficult decision really of moving this event online because of the rail strikes, and despite being in solidarity with the claims and the strike purposes, it was very hard for us to be able to bring our colleagues from the Midlands, which is obviously the focus also of the project, to bring them on the 31st of May to London. So we decided to move the event online. So today what we propose is a short introduction, as I said, by myself and my colleague Paul, where we hope to provide the general framework about the project, and also Paul will join to share some of the reflections and recommendations that came throughout the process. I am also delighted to say that we will be joined then by Anjalie Dalal-Clayton, who accepted the invitation to respond to the publication, the report that we are also releasing today about this project. We'll have a short moment for comments and questions from you. So again, if you want to join, raise your digital hand and we'll make sure to unmute your mic. Then followed by a roundtable, The Changing Same, where Ian Surgeon and Marlene Smith, who are 2 of the members of the working group for this project, and also Paul, myself, and Anjalie will join this roundtable, where we are hoping to unpack some of the questions and ideas, again, that had been shared today, but also some of the things that came throughout the process. And finally, we have 15 minutes allocated for any additional questions and comments from you, and we will hope to wrap up by 7:30. Okay, so I'll start by introducing the project. So as I said before, the title is quite long, but I think it gives you already the cues. So the title of the project from the beginning was The Role of Visual Arts Organizations in the British Black Arts movement in the Midlands that I co-developed and also delivered with Paul. And this project from the beginning wanted to explore the institutional and curatorial strategies of the Black Arts movement in the 80s in the Midlands, and also look at the institutional support in promoting and showing Black curators and artists then, so in the 80s mainly. And we were thinking of some of the activities involved, especially the Wolverhampton Gallery, the Herbert Gallery and Museum in Coventry, Icon, etc. But we also wanted to establish a network that could bring together cultural organizations and practitioners in the region to understand how the 80s movement's motivations and drives could provide models for the sector today. So that connection for us was quite important. So we started planning this project actually in 2019 when I first joined Coventry University, and also after being involved in the public program at Notting Contemporary of the exhibition The Place Is Here, which was a survey of some of the Black Arts movement artists from the 80s to today. Together with colleagues, back then I was working in Nottingham, and we wanted to continue the work and use the research resources, also those that exist at in university, to bring those resources together in order to further expand the project and also to bring together some of our cultural partners in the region. And this conversation started way before the 25th of May 2020, which anniversary was just a few days ago, the day of the tragic death of George Floyd in the hands of the police in the US, and also the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's important to say that despite the conversations starting before this event, it really gave the project a renewed purpose, and obviously was something that became very much part of the whole, not only the framework, but also the conversations we were having within the project. Gabrielle, can I ask you to show the next slide, please? Thank you. So in terms of the aims of the project, so initially, as I said, we really wanted to look at the legacies of the Black Arts movement in the Midlands, and also what we identified back then being the understudied role of the visual arts institutions in supporting this movement in the 80s. And really to look at the work that some of the artists involved did to create shared social spaces, spaces that were not necessarily there for them to show and produce their work, and how those social spaces were also being informed through curatorial energies. And most of the times done by artists, so colleagues who had been trained in visual arts, who would take upon themselves also the role of organizing and curating. And we know, obviously, some of them, and not least, I would mention Marlene Smith, who is here today with us, who is a good example of how some of these artists also cross the boundaries between artistic practices and curatorial practices. And we wanted to look at how also these public institutions in the region were back in the day reacting or made to react to these invitations and these exhibitions that were happening in the region. So this is one of the angles, let's say, of the project. But also this network also aimed to actualize the 1980s movement's motivations in light of today's response of the sector in supporting, promoting, and showing Black curators and artists. So again, as I said before, it was very relevant for us to understand how these legacies were being cared for, but also how they represented models, inspiration for how institutions were today also thinking about their program, also about recruitment and their purpose within the communities where they are based. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of how we wanted to do this, was really to foster also research cooperation on Black studies art and curation between Coventry University, the UAL, of course, and not least the visual arts organizations and cultural practitioners in the region. So, as I said before, this is a project that we're very much established as a network. And so the idea was to bring these stakeholders together around the table to have these discussions. Also, we wanted to raise awareness of the unique and pioneering role of the Black Arts movement in the Midlands, and not least among the visual arts organizations. We thought and we understood back in the day that there was a kind of a lack of representation of this narrative as well in the ways in which these institutions were presenting themselves, and how these histories were part of their identity. We also wanted to create an opportunity to share and exchange knowledge, specifically in three main areas. The first one on the history of the Black Arts movement in the region, also the histories of Black curation in the region, and finally, as I said before, to connect to the current contemporary challenges for Black curators and artists in the region. Can I have the next slide, please? So the way in which we wanted to do that was to bring colleagues together and be able to have sustained conversations and debates around these issues that I mentioned. So we invited a fantastic group of colleagues to form a working group, and we met quite regularly to bring insight from a range of experiences and to provide also some strategic advice and direction to the team, so myself and Paul, and also to draw on their very relevant expertise and experience. And the group also ensured the activities aligned with the project's purpose from day one. And this group of colleagues are Marlene Smith, who I know doesn't need introductions, an artist and curator and one of the founding members of the Black Arts Group, and currently leader for the Black British Art Research Group, British Art Network, which is a Tate initiative. Also, Shaheen Merali, a curator, critic, and artist, and Merali began his artistic practice as well as Marlene Smith in the 80s, and his work very much committed to social, political, and personal narratives. Shaheen is also currently a PhD candidate at Coventry University. And we invited two other colleagues who are also practicing in the region. So Sylvia Theory, who is an art educator, researcher, and independent curator, currently a lecturer in contextual fine arts and photography at University of Wolverhampton, and Ian Surgeon, who is also joining today our roundtable, a postdoc research fellow with Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage at University of the Arts London, part of the Decolonizing Art Institute. And Ian is also a curator for Coventry Biennial. I just wanted to quickly mention that Sylvia and Ian had just recently opened an exhibition at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, precisely looking at the artistic activities of the Black Art Group between 79 and 84. And I couldn't recommend more. So if you are in the region, or you should actually go all the way to Wolverhampton and definitely enjoy the show. And I think it's going to be until July, if I'm not mistaken. And in addition to the working group, we also invited a few partners to join this process. And I have to say that all the partners are visual arts organizations based in the Midlands, but there were two different criteria really for us to choose our partners. One had to do with a historical relationship that some of these cultural organizations had with the Black Arts movement. So for instance, the Herbert Gallery and Museum with the exhibition in '83 of the Pan-African Connection, which is one of the Black Art Group exhibitions in the region, and also Wolverhampton Gallery with Black Art Undone in '81, and also the relation to of the city with the first Black Arts Convention in '82. And then the other say group of partners because they all followed a different criteria, not least because both New Art Exchange and Nottingham Contemporary are two organizations that opened recently. So say 2008 and 2009, if I'm not mistaken. But it was important for us to bring also partners that had a strong commitment, we believed, to diversity and representation in these fields. And so New Art Exchange being an organization that since its foundation, it's been dedicated to artists and communities from global majority, and also came out of the community centers activities where now New Art Exchange is based, a community center in Hyson Green in Nottingham that very much was a hub also for a lot of the anti-racism activities happening back then, but also related to some of the artists that were doing their degree at Trent Polytechnic, including Keith Piper and Saeed Adrus and others. And then finally, Nottingham Contemporary, we thought because of the relation also to the show, The Place Is Here, that was curated in 2017 with Nick Icons. But I have to say that due to capacity and also the lack of commitment at the level that the project required, Nottingham Contemporary had withdrawn from the project. So it's no longer a partner, and we can expand a bit more on that during the conversation. Next slide, please. So finally, just to quickly skim through the activities, let's say, involved in the last 2 years. As I mentioned, so the partners meetings and the working group meetings, incredibly, I think, foundational for us to have a sounding board to keep developing the project. Also, we organize a few workshops. One happened at New Art Exchange in Nottingham last year, and it was also an opportunity for us to meet for the first time in person, one detailed but important one, I think, and also for us to understand also how partners saw themselves, saw their role really as part of this project. So we invited partners to answer a simple question, to give a short presentation as part of the workshops, really at the beginning, and to present an event, an activity in the history of their institutions that they found radical, transformative. And this was the beginning of our day of conversations, but was very much kind of to provide, I guess, the materials for us to then further unpack and discuss throughout the day. So the second workshop happened at Wolverhampton Art Gallery in January, so 2023. And it was slightly different because at that stage of the process, we were already not only interested in looking at the role of these institutions, but also to look at more informal institutional structures sitting outside of structures such as organizations with ongoing regular funding, with the venue, but thinking of other initiatives that happen across the region and were absolutely fundamental also to drive different kinds of instituent practices or different kinds of making institutions, and also despite precarious sometimes and vulnerable and short-lived, not least because of funding, but always being driven by a very urgent purpose. And so we thought it was important for us to map those practices too. On that occasion, we had invited Jagdish Patel, an artist, activist, and researcher based in Nottingham, also currently doing a PhD at Coventry University, and also Laura Nyawi, who is the artistic director of Maoko, which is an organization based in Coventry, precisely supporting artists of color in the region. We also publish a series of blog posts with activity related to what I just described, but also activities of colleagues that were happening in the region. And finally, we put together a publication with recommendations, which is the one that we are sharing with you today, or we will in the chat box. I'm not sure it's already posted. Just before I wrap up and hand over to Paul, and next slide, please. I just wanted to finally mention that this, thank you, that this project that I just described is not a one-off initiative. Actually, it's part of a larger constellation of initiatives and projects that delve into the same subject matters. I just wanted to briefly mention what we've done, the work we've done during the Coventry City of Culture with the support of Maoko and also the Herbert, where we brought together a group of young Black artists in the region precisely to discuss some of the legacies of the Black arts movement, and also to think of the role of the local organizations in the city. Also, the project organized and curated by Paul, titled Genealogies of Black Curation in Britain, which is looking at the emergent strategies and agency of Black curatorial practices in Britain over the past 40 years. And I think you can now see a link for these projects here in the chat box if you want to see more. Also, the PhD scholarships at the Center for Arts, Memory and Community specifically focus on Black artistic practices and curation, funded by Coventry University and also the Arts and Humanities Research Council. An event we organized as part of Coventry Biennial, curated by Ian Sargent, where we were in conversation with Keith Piper and Marlene Smith, looking at the exhibition in '83 that happened at the Herbert, a series of also conversations about the Black arts movement in Coventry that I can share the link with you, and also some of the work we are doing with the Faculty of Arts and Humanities in Coventry, namely with the MA in Architecture and the module Critical Investigations that have involved also some of the working group members present here today. So, thank you so much for your attention, of course, and for joining us today. I will now hand over to Paul, who will share with us some of the reflections and also recommendations of the project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carolina, for that overview of the project. And wanted to say as well, it's been such a pleasure working with you on this project, and with all the colleagues mentioned, the institutions and the group that we worked with, and have all really given their time and care and critique. We had lots of many, very constructive conversations over quite a difficult period, because the project really took place initially during COVID. So for a year, we were having conversations online, as Carolina has mentioned, and we only met for the first workshop, after about a year of conversations, which is always quite a difficult thing. And at that point, I hadn't actually met Carolina until we actually had the workshop. So somehow we managed to kind of keep this all together and come up with this project. So what I want to just briefly talk about, and I won't take long so we can get more space for Anjalie in the conversation, is, as Carolina mentioned, this was funded by the AHRC as a research network. So it's not necessarily a research project as such. It's more about getting conversations and getting people together. And as Carolina has mentioned, we worked with institutions as well as artists and curators and activists to have various conversations. And then what we try to do is also think about, in a way, moving from critique, which is the usual kind of starting point for many academics, to think about recommendations in terms of thinking about what practically can we maybe suggest humbly as ways of thinking through this issue. I would just say a quick word about the title of the publication, The Changing Same, which actually is taken from an essay in 1966 by Amiri Baraka, one of the doyens of the Black art movement in the United States, or Leroy Jones, as he was called, an expert on Black music and Black culture generally, particularly in the form of United States. And he wrote a really fantastic article in '66 called The Changing Same, which was really looking at the ways that Black music had evolved over time, and had moved from kind of forms of thinking about the blues towards avant-garde jazz and free music. And the way that he talked about this sort of process, this sort of dialectical process, on the one hand, there was an incredible evolution in that journey from the blues and the plantations and the southern context and the racism and the systematic and the racial terror that produced those forms, towards this free jazz, and how those forms of the ways music took change rapidly and evolved rapidly. But yet, at the same time, there were some fundamentals that stayed the same and that characterize the Black radical tradition, forms of improvisation, for example, in music, which have always been a staple throughout Black music. So on the one hand, you have this dialectic between, on the one hand, constant change, but also the ways that resistance and Black traditions stay the same. And so in a way, we can apply that kind of logic to the ways that, in some ways, that the relationship of Black artists and Black people in general towards institutions, right? In the sense that institutions often change. Policies change from diversity to decolonization, for example, as it's changing now. But the result is possibly the same. So some things stay the same, whereas sometimes at the same time, there are claims that there are changes in evolution. So it kind of works on both sides. So what we were trying to, in a way, by titling the title The Changing Same, we were kind of looking at that dynamic, the fact that the relationship of Black artists institutions obviously has evolved massively. We're now in a stage post George Floyd and Black Lives Matter in 2020, where institutions are opening up in certain respects again, as they did in the early 80s. And so there's a sense in which perhaps there's some change, but we also know that certain things have stayed the same. Racism hasn't gone away, and certain forms of exclusion are still in operation. So we were kind of looking at that dynamic as possibly a way of characterizing the relationship between Black artists and institutions in the Midlands, and also, of course, nationally. So in terms of the recommendations, really we were drawing on the conversations that we had with artists, with curators, with the institutions, who generously gave time, as Carolina said, often behind closed doors, to assure anonymity, and also to give people space and time to think about and to be open about this conversation. And we really thank all of the partners for being brave enough, in a way, to take part in those discussions. And then we kind of drew on that to kind of think about some areas where we can think about some changes and some challenges, and some interventions that possibly could take place. And those come under three areas that we've identified. One is institutional structures. So this in the report, in the section, the final section of the report, deals with recommendations and proposals. And so one of the areas is institutional structures, which is looking at really challenges at the level of organizational structure. So questions around diversity, the role of diversity. Is it an add-on, or is it something which needs to be part of the everyday working organization? For example, another example is the relationships that institutions have with communities. Are they ephemeral, or are they longer? Can they be longer lasting? We also looked at the ways in which often questions around diversity or change tends to be separate from the actual program and farmed out to the learning department or to the outreach department, are not necessarily part of the center of the organization. There's also a question of archives, and that perhaps many institutions are not aware of or neglecting the incredible work of Black and global majority archivists, documentarians and researchers who've been doing work for decades, and whose work has not really been drawn on by many institutions. It presents itself as a resource that we think should be looked at. The second area is funding, of course, the question of funding, which was a very important theme in the recent Documenta 15 in Kassel, and in the context of Palestine. And the question that funding it has an important role, not only for the institutions itself, but of course for artistic production and how that works. And of course, in this area, we looked at areas around how funding can be discontinued at short notice, for example, and how people can, and how organizations and institutions can be victims of that kind of short-termism in funding. We looked at questions around staff structure and how funding is usually used to grow capacity and recruit new staff, but how that also perhaps leaves other areas interrupted or not developed. And then the final area that we kind of identified and talk about is around the need for critical infrastructures. And so, of course, thinking about the question of coloniality of institutions and the heritage, if you like, the colonial heritage that many of these institutions have, is how equipped are these institutions to really taking on board that heritage and taking it seriously? How in terms of the knowledge, that's the productive knowledge in these fields, how are they equipped to deal with, for example, decolonial practices? How are they equipped to take on board the questions, important questions, epistemological and ontological, posed by, for example, Black studies? And so we kind of talk about the need to create a robust research-informed culture, and to move away from this idea of reacting to situations, and to actually take that on board as part of what institutions do. So, for example, some of the recommendations in these areas, and I'll just give a few. You can obviously read them in the report. So, some of them are pretty straightforward and probably quite obvious. Some of them perhaps are going to add new ways of thinking. So, for example, we talk about the need to provide training in institutional structures. We talk about the need to provide training for all staff in equality, decolonial practices, and critical thinking. That sounds pretty obvious, but at the moment, the focus is on EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And we feel that that can also be part of the changing same. That's not necessarily going to change the structural relationship of these institutions to Black communities, for example. We talk about the need to implement an agenda for change around boards of trustees, perhaps limiting the length of trustee tenure, for example, and to make sure that trustees are suitably, quote unquote, diverse and draw from all sectors of the community. These, again, fairly obvious but quite important issues. For funding, for example, we definitely identify, one of the things that came up in many conversations was the need for a more long-term approach rather than short-termism, which is often the ways that institutions fund Black artists. It's reactive, it's opportunistic, it's relating to, George Floyd or another event, and not thinking in the long term. So we need to really think about encouraging more long-term grants that allow structural change, allow failure as well, and experimentation. We also need to think about promoting funding opportunities to create critical infrastructures instead of output-based focuses. And then in terms of critical infrastructures, that we kind of talked about the need for, we're often institutions, for very good reasons, are not necessarily equipped or have the resources in time to develop the critical thinking around decolonial practices, for example, or Black studies, that is necessary in order to really engage in change. So we suggest, and some institutions are doing this, to reach out, for example, to activists and to academics and to others who do have that areas. And we've identified some areas and some subjects that they could deal with. For example, there should be more understanding of the history of Black curation in the UK. That history, which is now starting to be written about and discussed, is something that needs to be brought into the mainstream environment of these institutions. Also, for example, when you think about the impact of the Black Lives Matter protests in terms of policy, how do you decolonize a collection, and also thinking about what you might call critical Black instituting practices. So practices that we can learn. I think these institutions can learn from organizations and community groups that are out there, and activist groups that have been doing practices in the margins for a long time. How can institutions really learn from that? So these are some of the recommendations and some of the areas that we focus on in the project that you can read in the report. I'll hand back to Carolina.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for that very good summary indeed of what we put together with the support of our colleagues in the last 2 years. Now we will move to say the second part of this event, where I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Anjalie Dalal-Clayton, as I said before, who has kindly accepted our invitation to read the report and also to provide today a response on that topic. So I will introduce Anjalie, and then I'll hand over to Anjalie for that response before we reconvene for the Q&A. So Anjalie Dalal-Clayton is an art historian who specializes in the art and exhibition histories of Black and Brown artists in Britain. She's currently a research fellow at University of the Arts London's Decolonizing Arts Institute, where her research focuses on collecting, interpretation, and display practices in public museums. I've also to say that Anjalie is involved in many projects, including as co-investigator on the UAL-led Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage Research Project, also funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Also, Anjalie is conducting an update of the Black Artists and Modernists audit, which is incredible to hear, a project led some years ago by Professor Sonia Boyce. And also Anjalie is currently co-investigator on the Tate-led research project, Provisional Semantics, addressing the challenges of representing multiple perspectives within an evolving digitized national collection. Thank you again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours, Anjalie.
Hello. Okay. I have prepared a few notes to refer to. I'm going to speak for about maybe 10 minutes. So thanks so much to Carolina and Paul for inviting me to respond to the publication and to participate in this discussion. I'd like to start by saying that I think the premise for the project is really important to the historicisation and historiography of the British Black Art movement. In the publication, it's claimed that the Midlands is a much neglected region in studies of Black British art, which I sort of disagree with. I think when the movement is mentioned, it does invoke an idea of the movement emerging and taking place across key sites in the Midlands. But I do agree that the specific role of the organisations in the movement's development in that period isn't well known or studied, which I think is kind of the main premise of the project. And so my understanding is that the project is a starting point or a trigger for research in the fields of art history and exhibition histories involving a combination of archival evidence and oral histories. I also think it's important that this project has highlighted that it's the precise nature of the relationships between institutions, institutional directors and curators and artists that needs investigating, as well as the relationship of this triangulation to broader socio-political developments and changes in cultural policy. I'm intrigued by the idea in the publication of trying to understand the informal structures that were created by Black and brown artists and organisers during the 1980s, and how those structures interlinked with and were sometimes operating at odds with the structures of formal cultural institutions. And I'll be keen to hear more about what was unearthed in relation to what's described in the publication as Black instituent practices during the workshops that we've heard about just now. So I hope this is something that we can discuss in the roundtable shortly. When I was reading about how the project was constructed through a series of closed door events and conversations that were devised, not to generate concrete outputs, but instead to generate a critical debate and reflection among participants, it struck me that there were similarities between this project and a workshop program I organised at around the same time called Doing the Work. And that program was set up to open up a space for museum workers already engaged in anti-racist or decolonial activities to share and discuss the successes and failures of the approaches they tested, and to offer peer support in developing new models in curation, interpretation, audience engagement, and cataloguing in the museum. And like the Changing Same project, in the Doing the Work program, we were trying to offer safe spaces for critical and honest discussion, but it wasn't always successful. And so I'd love to hear more in a moment about how the project format went and what the partners and participants felt worked and didn't work. Now, there's a section in the publication in which Carol Thompson, who's Chief Curator at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, reflects on the role of the gallery in supporting the work of Black artists, and particularly through the staging of the 1981 exhibition Black Art Undone. She particularly notes the important role played by the director David Rogers and assistant curator Brendan Flynn in helping to bring the exhibition to fruition. And she also suggests that there was something of an equitable distribution of power between the gallery and the artists. And when I was reading this section of the publication, it struck me that there were many potential similarities between what happened at Wolverhampton Art Gallery in the early 1980s and the Blue Coat Art Centre in Liverpool during the same period, which is something that I investigated as part of my doctoral research between 2010 and 2015. And so I'd now like to just say a few words summarising my research on the Blue Coat in order to offer a point of comparison with some of the Midlands organisations that partnered on this project. So the Blue Coats programme had included a couple of Black and brown artists before the 1980s, but it wasn't until Eddie Chambers got in touch in 1983 asking for an exhibition that an engagement with artists involved in the British Black Arts movement really began. Chambers' proposal was initially rejected by the Blue Coats Exhibition Committee, but the following year, its director, Brian Biggs, visited Keith Piper's exhibition, Past Imperfect Future Tense, at the Black Art Gallery in London, as well as the Into the Open show at the Mappin Art Gallery in Sheffield. And the power of the work shown in those two exhibitions prompted Biggs to organise a show at the Blue Coat in 1985 that would come to be known as Black Skin Blue Coat, which would be the first of many shows that featured work by key protagonists in the Black art movement at the Blue Coat over the course of the 80s and 90s. And I think, I consider Black Skin Blue Coat as a watershed moment in the Blue Coat's institutional and programme history, because of the way the show was reportedly devised in open dialogue with the artists involved, which in turn fostered long-term relationships between them and Biggs as the centre's artistic director, leading to quite a rich programme from the 1980s to now, in which curatorial models have been tested and nuanced readings of work by Black artists could be developed. So there are some obvious parallels with the history of Wolverhampton Art Gallery. So that's the pivotal role played by key individuals in both institutions whose personal passions and dialogic ways of working helped bring Black artists into view within the civic gallery circuit, at least. However, when I was reading about the concurrent role and activities of Wolverhampton Art Gallery in the publication, I found myself questioning how this institutional history or narrative, or institutional histories and narratives more generally, are developed and what they're based on, and particularly the dangers of creating institutional histories on the basis of anecdotal storytelling. And that's because when I was conducting research on the Blue Coat, I found that oral history didn't always match archival evidence, and that individuals can sometimes subconsciously recall the past through the lens of the present, reframing past decisions and actions as perhaps a little more intentional and radical than perhaps they really were. And in research that I've done on Graves Gallery in Sheffield, I suspect this might sometimes happen at an institutional level, so that the institution can offer a particular, perhaps disingenuous narrative of the past in order to reposition itself in the present as always having met its social or civic purpose. And so for this reason, I think it's vitally important that any further activity or publications that develop from this project, which attempt to offer a history of the role played by organisations in the Midlands in the British Black Art movement, that needs to be grounded in rigorous evidence-based research involving personal and institutional archives as well as oral history. And this is a critical combination in my view, because just as you can't rely on human memory to offer an accurate representation of the past, you can't actually rely on institutional archives either. Meeting minutes and reports often gloss over the attitudes that inform decision making and flatten out the turbulences and debate that occurs between artists and institutions when exhibitions and events are being devised. So it is really good to see that in this project, that the project has brought artists and institutions together to begin this work, and that combination will remain critical if the project leads to further historical research. I have one final point that I want to kind of talk around, which is in relation to the recommendations that have been put forward in this publication. Several of the recommendations are similar to the provocations that came out of the Doing the Work programme, which isn't to diminish their importance, but it does show that these insights are not unique to this project, or indeed other projects. Recommendations are not unique to those. So I think many of the observations of this project and the Doing the Work programme have been observed in several other projects, some of which go back several decades, occurring, every 5 to 10 years since the 1980s, but they're not well recorded and vanish from institutional memory within a few years. So creating a bit of a cycle of projects and research exploring similar things and making similar recommendations again and again. So a question that I would like to pose for the roundtable is, if multiple projects are observing similar problems and making similar recommendations, what is it going to take to get people and organisations in positions of real influence to actually action them? So I'm keen to hear more about also who the recommendations in this publication are aimed at, and what response, if any, the project team expect to receive. And I think that's the end of my ramblings.
No, thank you so much for that, Anjalie. And it's it had the acuity and the rigor that I knew that you would bring to this discussion, and for which your work is, which really is a hallmark of your excellent research. What we're going to do now then is move to this panel discussion as we plan this. So perhaps we can welcome Ian Sargent and Marlene Smith to the conversation. So if I could ask you to turn your cameras on, and that way we can start the conversation. Wonderful, great. So I believe that Carolina did do a brief introduction to both Marlene and Ian in her conversation, but I'll just do a slightly more in-depth one. So Dr. Ian Sargent is postdoctoral research fellow with the Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage at University of the Arts London, the Decolonising Arts Institute, of which Anjalie is one of the members. He's also the curator for Coventry Biennial, and he completed his PhD on visual representations and cultural reconstructions of Black British masculinities in 21st century Birmingham City Universities. He's curated many projects, including work at a number of key projects around Donald Rodney, with Vivid Projects in 2016, and also at Glasgow International in 2021, and of course at New Art Exchange. He's also a director of the Performing and Visual Arts Organisation Collaboration CIC, and is on the board of directors of Vivid Projects, a non-profit company supporting media practice. He's a member of the Black Art Group research project set up by former Black Art Group members Claudette Johnson, Marlene Smith and Keith Piper in 2011. And I do believe that Keith Piper has joined us this evening, so welcome Keith. Marlene Smith from Birmingham is an artist and curator, and one of the founding members, of course, of the Black Art Group. She's currently leader of the Black British Art Group and the British Art Network project, the Black British Art Research Group, part of the part of the British Art Network. She was co-curator for the exhibition Nation's Finest, Putting Down Roots and Birthing in 2021 to 22, and associate for Lubena Hamid's Making History's Visible Archive at UCLan, University of Central Lancashire, between 2017 and 22. She was, of course, also part of the research manager for the Black Arts and Modernism Project, University of the Arts London, that Carolina mentioned, was led by Sonia Boyce, and also included myself and Anjalie Dalal-Clayton, as well as David DeBosa and Susan Priest-Locke. And of course, she's also an associate artist at Modern Art Oxford and has involved in many exhibitions recently, including Black Art Collection Highlights at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, Cut and Mix at New Art Exchange in Nottingham in 2022, and Thinking Black, a montage of Black art in Britain at the Van Abbe and Eindhoven in 2016, and many others beside. So welcome everyone to the panel. Anjalie's laid down some really interesting questions and thoughts that I think we can perhaps use as a starting point for discussion. And I'll start actually with Anjalie's final questions, which was really echoing the whole notion of the changing same, right? Which is that, and this is very familiar, I think, to many of us who are working in this field, right, around Black art, which is that, there have been a whole cycle over many years of similar projects to this one that make similar recommendations for change, for institutions to think long-term, etc., etc. And the question is, what will it take to actually change the discourse? Is that what you were saying, Anjalie? Yeah. So shall we maybe perhaps start with that? And I'd love to hear, let's start with Ian, if I may, Ian. And please read in the publication, we have some beautiful interviews with Ian and Marlene, where they go into depth in very sincere and quite brave, I think, discussions around the role of institutions. And they're two beautiful interviews, actually. And I think one of the highlights of the publication. So please have a look at that. But Ian, the changing same, or where are we? Are we on a revolving escalator that we can never get out of, or what's your perspective?
Thank you for inviting me onto this discussion panel, and thank you all for your wonderful presentations, Anjalie and Paul and Carolina. Hello, Marlene. Hello, Keith in the background. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, sorry, Ian, before
yes.
I do that, I just realized
Mm.
that we were meant to have some questions for Anjalie's presentation. But what we'll do, okay,
Fold
what we'll
it
do,
in. Fold it in.
yeah, we'll fold
Fold
that
it,
in.
fold it in.
We'll fold.
Fold
So
Okay.
Ian will give a response, and
Okay.
then please, if you have the audience, if you have any questions for Anjalie's presentation, please
Okay.
provide them in the text, or you can raise your hand, and then we can open up the mics. So Ian, please, sorry to disturb you.
Yeah, so this was about what needs to be done in regards to institutions for change to really happen. First, I just wanted to kind of make some just make some corrections as well. I am one of 3 curators at Coventry Biennial, along with Annika French and Ryan Hughes, who's the CEO. I'm an artistic director. I'm one of 3. And it's strange, and it's actually what I find quite interesting is that the title of this research is quite similar to the exhibition title, The More Things Change, which myself and Sylvia came out of conversation when we were kind of developing the exhibition. We were kind of kept that phrase kept coming up, and Sylvia was saying this, you know, the more things change, you know, we kind of, and that reference then it sparked there was a light bulb moment when I've read this recently, and it was James Baldwin was kind of talking about this idea of, you know, how again that idea that as you know, as much of the progress that was happening that he could see, you know, that undercurrent, that wider culture, that wider structures within society, those things remain, you know, still remain the same, whilst all those kind of advancements we're making within, you know, arts practice and literature and culture and all those kind of things. There was still this undercurrent of, you know, discrimination and racism, et cetera, still prevalent throughout society. So when we were coming up with the title for the exhibition, The More Things Change, it was about this idea that, you know, the advancements that was being made by Marlene and the other artists included in the exhibition, Keith and Claudette and Donald and Janet, to say that, you know, okay, we're looking at work from historical work, but also more recent contemporary work. And within that narrative of what was happening, you know, that response that they were making at the time in the 1980s was in response to those frictions within society, to those, really dreadful situations and circumstances, but also what they were also doing, it was, you know, using their experience and knowledge of, you know, coming out of art school to then apply these ways of thinking and doing within this context of fine art and modern arts practices. And what we wanted to say, and what we want to say from this exhibition, is actually, let's try and change the narrative of how we talk about this work. Let's take a renewed look at this work through a lens of modernity, of arts practice, and not just kind of keep reverting back to this way of framing the work through this, you know, socio-political lens and only seeing that. Let's look at the art, let's talk about the materiality, let's talk about other things within that. But again, we keep getting drawn back into this kind of conversation around just the one thing, just that kind of binary narrative of that. And I think you can also say that then in terms of when we're looking at Black and South Asian and other ways of being, that a lot of the time it is through that singular lens rather than a more expansive way of engagement, of kind of understanding and reflecting and looking at something. So what I think institutions, going back to your question, what I think institutions need to do, and I think something that I say within that conversation that we had, was that people need to look at their structures, that the institutions really need to look at their structures long and hard and say, do we really reflect how society has evolved over time? And what are we doing? What can we do to actually truly reflect that by, shaking up, sometimes making that brave move and stepping aside to let somebody in that, that has a different way of looking at things. So those are the, that is one of the kind of brave decisions that institutions can take. But then also then to kind of not do it on a, do it on a tokenistic kind of basis, but do it with the intention that actually we're bringing in the right kind of candidates. Because, as we've seen, through the politics that's happening right now, that not everybody's going to be, thinking the same way just because they look like us. They don't all, they don't all kind of think in that same way. So there is that danger that, okay, then we'll find somebody that will, that can fulfill that role. But, they're then just kind of then going back down the same route and then reapplying some of those same methods that have seemed to kind of, fail, or not fail, but cause more problems kind of going forward. So, yeah, I think it's up to the institutions then to kind of just look at themselves and make some of those kind of brave decisions, and bring in some newer voices, some different voices, and start to actually apply some of these recommendations, because there's been so many projects over the years. I've been involved in so many projects over the years, and yet we're still having this conversation. So it must mean that something's not working, or somebody's not listening, or these recommendations are just, for, project by project. We're constantly in these kind of holding patterns when nothing really lands, and that's part of the problem. How can we get beyond these, this kind of holding pattern? So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Marlene. I hope some of that makes sense, but yeah, I'll hand over to Marlene.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Anjalie. That was a really succinct and poignant set of questions that you posed for us. So I'm going to pick up where Ian left off and talking about the what's going. If as Anjalie says, and I agree with her, there have been a number of these enterprises trying to make change. Lots of recommendations have been made and none have been carried out. Then I think that what we need to be looking at is our arts organisations from the top down. I think that what happens often is that these reports get filed away, or the people involved in developing them are not at the top of the organisation. And I think that what needs to happen is that there needs to be root and branch changes, and that has to be led by the most senior people in the organisation. And I think that if we did that, we'd at least see some change happening. I mean, I think that Anjalie reminded us of what happened at Blue Coat. And I don't think she's setting up Blue Coat as an example of perfection, but at least we can see through their history of an attempt to wrestle with some of these issues, and we can see what result that had on their program. And I think that one of the things about Blue Coat, I was just sitting and doodling when Anjalie was talking, is that one of the things that makes Bluecoat different to Wolverhampton, for example, is that Brian Biggs has been there forever. And it was his commitment, seriously though, it was his personal commitment that got Keith Piper into the space in the first place, and then which repeatedly has engaged with Black critical mass over the decades that have followed. And I think that's what happens in arts organizations, that the power is with individuals, and individuals move around, and the power gets dissipated. So I think it's really important that one of the questions Anjalie asked is who are these reports for? And I think that it has to be for the directors and chair people of the organization. That's who needs to be sitting around the table having the conversation. And if we did that in more instances than we have done, that we would see more change. And the other thing that I was grappling with when I was thinking about Brian, as opposed to Wolverhampton's had several directors over the same period of time. When I think about Brian, I think that he's really committed to one space, and he's in that city, he's been in that city for, I don't know, 40 years. And I can't think of another. There are a few of them around the country, a few spaces where they've maintained the same director for decades, but we're not necessarily putting that forward as the objective. I think one of our suggestions in our list of recommendations is that people hang on to power for too long, and that we need to get a new broom sweeping up the corners. But I do think we need to think about how power is implemented in those organizations, and it is top down. So our recommendations need to think about the top down. Okay, I'm just repeating myself now, so I'll shut up.
Thank you, Marlene. I mean, as you were talking about, you know, for it, picking up on what Anjalie was saying, you know, for every David Rogers, Brendan Flynn's, or Brian Biggs, who are, you know, visionaries or individual people that are committed to the local community or committed to, you know, forms of art making that perhaps are beyond the mainstream, there are many more who have been there for ages who are not. Absolutely. And who are actually blocking change, right? So one of the recommendations that we do mention, or we kind of report on, which again is debatable, is that more change is needed, that perhaps there should be more circulation in leadership organizations, so that board members, for example, are not staying on board for, you know, 10 years or whatever. And the same with leaders. There needs to be kind of a rotation. But to come back, Anjalie, I mean, just to come back to your to the comments that you mentioned, I mean, you talk about the kind of the ways, the institutional memories, and the gaps in institutional memories, or the ways that institutions often have a kind of a disingenuous, I think you talked about a disingenuous narrative about the past and about how radical they were, which is kind of repurposed for, you know, the current circumstances. And actually, your argument is that we can't just rely on that narrative, or just on all narratives. That has to be matched with rigorous archival research. And in our recommendation, we talk about some of that archival research has to come from Black and Asian archivists, you know, Panchayat and other archives that are now coming into collections, right? Not just, do you know what I mean? So, I mean, I wonder if you could maybe just expand on that a bit in terms of your practice, in terms of, you know, how we get past this disingenuous narrative that some institutions are constructing. What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a case of getting past it, and it's not an accusation that there's a conscious sort of disingenuous retelling of the past. I think it happens to every single one of us. You can't help but think back on what you were involved in the past through the lens of your life now, and what feels important to you now, and what are the current debates and things that feel important now. So I think that's okay. But if as this project has done, you're trying to examine a history or even produce a history, you know, it's wise to come at it from different angles, because there's no singular truth out there. So you know, every individual's memory and perspective needs to be taken into account, so that, you know, oral history is a really vital research method that I'm personally in my own practice trying to knit together with archival history. That's not new. That's a long-term standard approach, but it astounds me when you're actually doing that kind of research. Just like, I'm continually astounded by the importance of the combination of those two strands of approaches. And just to speak to, yeah, I think, you know, especially when it comes to civic institutions that are run differently from some of the national institutions, where, you know, you go to, so if you go to the website of a lot of our civic museums, you have to go through, you know, the leisure centres and libraries bits of the websites to get to find out what your local museum or gallery is doing. So it's really organised quite differently. And I think sometimes evidencing social purpose and meeting the social, you know, local needs becomes even more important in those kinds of spaces. And to be able to, you know, I've seen it myself, that this sort of subtle posturing that can take place, where, you know, you can claim a slightly more radical history than perhaps is true, and the only way that as a researcher that I can personally get to the bottom of that is to combine the oral histories with archival research, because neither one is perfect, but perhaps when you look at both, you start to find something of the truth in the middle. And that's always been my my approach, but, you know, it's not the only approach.
Thank you so much, Anjalie. We're soon going to open up for some questions. Before I do that, I wanted to turn to Carolina. One of the areas that we identify in the report is around critical infrastructures. And I know, Carolina, you've done a lot of work and research on instituting practices, on critical infrastructures. And I just wondered, in terms of thinking about that moving forward, in terms of this project, you know, how, you know, we're obviously trying to think about how we can recommending certain ideas around this. Sorry, I lost my thought. What I wanted to say, actually, Caroline, sorry, is that one of the things that we've spoken about, and that you've also mentioned in some of the interviews, is the relationship between universities and researchers and these institutions, right? And of course, you were curator before. You were at Coventry. You were curator of public programs, and director of public program education at Nottingham Contemporary, where in a way you kind of tested that model of how a museum or a local gallery can work with an academic environment in order to produce critical institution practice. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that and how that worked, and whether that could be a model for how we can take forward some of these questions around critical infrastructures.
Right, thank you. Yes, sure. I think also as part of that, to connect to some of the things we're already discussed, and not least the questions that Anjalie brought to the table, which are very, very thought-provoking. And one of the things that I would say in relation to how institutions have been dealing with this continuous process of eventual change is also the fact that, and we do bring some light actually to to that in the report, which is the fact that it seems like memory is very short. And one of the reasons, I think, is how archives are sort of underfunded. Let's just look at the process that it takes to put an exhibition together, and we've all been involved. So we know there's a lot of work being put before the exhibition opens. As soon as it opens, staff needs to start working on something else. So even during the duration of that exhibition, there's very little attention to the kinds of knowledges that are being produced, which arguably don't happen only prior to the opening. And this is what I would argue in terms of curatorial knowledge. There's a lot going on in the gesture of making public of those objects and the constellations of ideas that they generate. Now, what happens is that we are then already busy with something else, and not least to actually be able to capture and archive what that project generated. And so the same would happen eventually with this report and doing the work, for instance, fantastic work that Anjalie and other colleagues put together, and so on and so forth. So it's really about thinking in terms of what's the time allocated for these institutions, staff. And when I say a time, I also mean in terms of resources for this kind of, and I'm now, I think, hopefully finally answering your question slightly, Paul, in relation to the critical infrastructure, is that these changes shouldn't happen only at the level of cosmetics, shouldn't be happening only at the level of what is put out there for the audience to enjoy. Actually, what we're talking about here in terms of change is very much something that is needed within the structure, and not least within societal structure. And we know, for instance, reports around the Met Police and how it's structurally racist, etc. So we are not looking at cultural institutions here as isolated institutions. Actually, this is part of a much larger network. So when we talk about critical infrastructures, is in that sense, is that there's structures that need to be repurposed and rethought in order for that change eventually to emerge. And that change has to do with a different society altogether. Now, to talk about the project at Nottingham Contemporary, and to say, especially focusing on what Paul mentioned, is the fact that this project was fully funded by both universities in Nottingham. And this arrangement, let's say, this partnership is quite particular, because what it does to Nottingham Contemporary is that it generates a department that is not allocated to either the learning team or the exhibition team, is quite autonomous, and is called Public Programs and Research, and also means that the university, well, us as a program back in the day when I was curator there, we also have access to the infrastructure or to the resources available to academics at university. And I think what it generated was really a kind of a third space, which was neither being driven by Arts Council criteria, nor by, say, AHRC or even REF criteria. So really left a space for us to reimagine and repurpose the function of that department, and not least the program that it was curating. And one of the things that I thought also with this project when I first joined Coventry University, coming precisely from Nottingham Contemporary, was to bring to these series of questions and these issues that we are discussing here, precisely those resources that lack so much at cultural institutions. And again, we talk about time, we talk about the turnover of staff, for instance, super quick. Again, asking where is this knowledge going when people leave. So to think of ways in which we could bring more resources together that are not output driven, but eventually allow us to have these discussions and these conversations, most of them very uncomfortable, but nevertheless incredibly important and urgent. So eventually something to look at, and I want to wrap up because I'm aware of time, just to say maybe something to look at as a model, and to think of probably enacting similar instances also elsewhere.
Sure. No, okay, great. Thank you for that, Carolina. So we do have about 10 minutes or so. I think at this point, I think what we could do is, I think you should be able to, if you have a question, I noticed there are no questions at the moment in the chat. But if you have a question, you can just turn your camera on, like by the audience, or turn your mic on, and please answer a question. There is one from Nick Brown. Nick, did you want to turn your mic on camera to speak, or shall I read it for you? Okay. No. Okay. So maybe I'll read it. So there's a question here. Thanks. This is from Nick Brown. Thanks to all the speakers, and especially for the underlying research project. Early on, Paul mentioned about the role of critical infrastructures and institutions, as well as the role of galleries. I wanted to ask if any of the panel would like to speak about any of the supporting administrative infrastructures, such as West Midlands Ethnic Minority Arts Service, which I know that Marlene was initially involved in, journals such as 10/8 or the WEMAS published, the Blackboard Review, or multi-art form venues such as Drum, which I believe fairly recently closed due to lack of funding and reopened in a different guise, as well as the amazing archive amassed by Vanley Burke, now available at Birmingham Central Library. Sorry if this is too long a question. Please feel to respond to any aspect of it, if of interest. So, Ian, would you like to give a response to that? And then Marlene and Anjalie, whoever wants to come in.
Yeah, I can speak to. I worked at the Drum on a couple of occasions. It was sad when it closed down for various reasons. In terms of what it means in terms of its archive, what was really important that happened during the time that I was there, like the last part that I was there, was that a PhD project was created that Davinia Gregory took on as the researcher, and she worked with that archive and kind of spoke to a lot of the previous participants and organizations that were working through it, so that some of that narrative has been captured within that research. I don't know where exactly the archive itself, the actual physical archive of the Drum currently resides, and I think there is a project in itself to kind of perhaps unpick that and then properly make that available for future, because that was one of the reasons why setting up that PhD was because of that fear that that how was the Drum actually capturing its history, through the various projects that it was doing, through all the artists and other people that were kind of taking part and performing and delivering work there. How were we kind of capturing that history? And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of set up that PhD at that time. And so some of that narrative definitely exists within Davinia's research, but in terms of its actual physical presence, I don't know where that resides, and I think there in itself is a project that can be done, to bring that to life again in that regard. So that's what I can say about from that experience.
Great, thank you, Marlene.
A couple of names stood out for me from Nick's list. WEMAS was a project that I worked in 1980. I think it was 1987 to 1991 that I was at WEMAS. And WEMAS did, as Nick says, produce a publication called Blackboard Review, which I managed to do three issues of Blackboard Review while I was director at WEMAS. But I have to say that sadly, I don't know what archival material still exists that would give you an overview of what happened at WEMAS. At the time that WEMAS had its funding cut, and at the time that it had its funding cut, I was no longer working for them. But even if I had been, I don't know what I would have been able to do about collecting all the letters and posters and issues of the Blackboard Review. I think that a few copies of it still exist, which is why Nick Brown was able to name it, because he's probably seen it at Innova. But I think we're in a situation now where we know better than to let organizations like that close down without anybody looking after their material. But I'm afraid that in the 1980s, that happened far too often.
Yeah, that's a really good, important point. Anjalie, is there something you might want to address in terms of your extensive research in this field?
Oh, well, look, actually, I haven't, the organisations that Nick mentions, none of them I really knew about, because I haven't done that kind of detailed research of what's happened in the Midlands during that period. I could probably speak to about maybe some equivalent ones in the Liverpool area, but I mean, don't ask me, please.
I think that does, going back to one of the points you made, Anjalie, were you a bit critical of, or you kind of slightly disagreed with our focus on the Midlands? Not disagreed with it, but kind of questioning it.
No. What it was
the historicisation of it. Yeah.
No. I think there was just like a little line in the publication that said that the West Midlands had been overlooked in the historicisation of the British Black Arts movement, and I don't think that's quite true. But I do agree that the particular role of organisations and the relationships between artists and organisations hasn't been uncovered properly yet. So, and I understand that is really the focus of this project. So I think, the West Midlands particularly, and the Midlands in general, I think is the known and the popularly known geography of the early stages of the British Black Arts movement, but not anything much beyond that. And there is research, like including Davinia Gregory's research and stuff that has begun to do that. And I think this project will hopefully form the basis of maybe further research that will help to surface those narratives, those multi-perspectival narratives of that history.
Yeah, I think the kind of importance of the geographies, the variable geographies of Black British art is really important, and I don't think has actually been given that much. It's still very London centric or big city centric. One of the abiding memories of the Black Artists Modernism project was traveling the country with Marlene and yourself, Anjalie. I remember going to Edinburgh and looking at some of the archives there and talking to curators who had no idea whether they had Black artists in their collection, and even posing that question, they were like, "Oh, we should maybe have a look at this," And so there's still a lot to be unearthed, I think, around that. But let's see if there are any other questions. At the moment, there are no other questions in the chat, and what I don't know at the moment is whether people can actually unmute themselves to ask questions.
Yeah.
Caroline is saying no.
Can I ask you
Please.
You and Carolina a question then, Paul? And
Please.
I mean, in terms of the recommendations, which I'm yet to read the full report, and but in terms of what for you would be the key thing if you were offered the opportunity of, we can only do this one thing, what is it that what is it that you would really want to see come out of this for both of you? What would you really want to see come out of this process?
Carolina, do you want to
start? Yes. I think one thing would be to continue working with the organizations we involved. It's I think very challenging, and we people around the table involved in this process, we know that we realize that it's incredibly challenging for colleagues to have time to join and to commit, and I think that institutions should be given that opportunity, to be honest. And I think, again, these kinds of projects could take the ways in which we think about the role of visual arts organization much further, really to actualize its function. We are living in a completely different era. I mean, I was just talking to Paul the other day, and it's fascinating how museums changed very little since 19th century, since, you know, its foundation, and it really needs to be thought through differently. And of course, with colleagues without that capacity of, you know, just having some time. And when I say time, is not only sitting around the table, it's really taking the quality time to read, to question, to bring those things to the table, to articulate them differently. And I think it would be great if there's appetite, interest, and if we could work together more on this, because I don't think it's a one wonder trick, really. I think it really requires a lot of investment. And so I would say that if I had to pick one.
Just really quick for me, Ian, I think just going through your interview, Ian, the interview with you, there was quite a few quotes that I kind of highlighted that I think we also drew on in our recommendation. So, for example, you talk about the idea that in some of the conversations with the partner organizations, the question of guilt always comes up, and the curator or the person involved takes it personally and says, you know, it's not me, Gov. I mean, why are you blaming me? And it's trying to get people to think about, it's not about the individual, it's about the structures, the wider structures, right? So that raised the question. I mean, I responded to that by saying, is there a question about whiteness? I mean, to think about whiteness and how that operates in these institutions. There's also another quote that you mentioned in that publication where you say, moreover, it seems to me that there's a danger of equating diversity with Black art, instead of understanding that Black art is and has been for a long while part of the aesthetic canon. This idea that, you know, there's always equating diversity and art, and we need to kind of, you know, focus on the work, which is something that I know Anjalie, myself, and Marlene, we've talked about endlessly, you know, in Black artists and modernism. So again, the changing same, trying to get this thing. Let's end, because we've kind of gone slightly over. I know people want to go and have dinner and do what they're doing in the evening. Can we just end by just briefly going through, I'd like to ask everyone just briefly, what would be the next steps for this kind of, particularly this project or projects like this? How do we take this forward? I mean, we've got recommendations, we've got fantastic interviews, we've got these conversations. And again, we thank the institutions for opening themselves up, the ones that took part, because not all of them did take part, but the ones that did. What's the next step? How do we build on this? Marlene, can I start with you?
Oh my goodness, in the hot seat.
In 2 seconds.
I'm just following up on what I said about directors. I think I'd like to bring the directors together and have a conversation about the recommendations.
That's a great idea. We should do that. Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think that's what it's got to be. That's the thing. Yeah, get the directors to talk. Yeah, totally agree with that.
Great.
Yeah,
Anjalie?
I think it should be, if you can, get living past directors of these institutions with current directors together
Really
for a
good
closed
idea.
discussion.
Yeah,
that would be amazing. But also you have to ask people to come to these kinds of sessions prepared in advance to make a commitment to actioning some of the recommendations, because with the Doing the Work program, we took our recommendations to people working at directorship level of a lot of organizations, and there was a lot of polite nodding and agreement, but I'm skeptical as to whether people in directorship roles are able to take some of those recommendations forward, especially when above them is a board of trustees that may be highly resistant to those kinds of change that are being suggested. So even people in directorship positions are struggling to make the changes that they want. So, you know, invite the trustees along too, if you can. And but yeah, just to answer your question, I would love to see this lead to some kind of further research in the way that I described.
Thank you, Anjalie. Carolina, I'll leave the last word for you.
I just wanted to say in relation to the directors that we've evolved. Actually, our point of contact with institutions we invited to participate in this project was always with the directors, and I see that Carol was is still with us here from Wolverhampton Gallery. So I just don't know if I should wrap up, Paul, because I have a few things to share before we leave. Okay, so just to say that in addition to that implementation, and I think Board of Trustees is absolutely key, eventually even more than directorship, I would like also to see some focus on how artistic practices in the region have constituted some Black constituent practices, and this is one of the questions Anjalie asked, and I would like to give the example of the Black Art Group, who, if we look at what they were doing as a group, not as a collective, as Marlene pointed out in the last conversation, public conversation as part of the exhibition in Wolverhampton, we see a lot of interesting ways of constituting a structure that goes beyond just individual artists doing their work and wanting to promote it. And I think those instances need to be further developed, need to be further looked at and explored, because they really constitute the grammar of going about finding the spaces that don't exist just yet, and how they create also sounding boards, really. So people, like-minded people that are able to also push the work further. So if I may, I would like just to wrap up and start to thank, obviously, our audience, people that joined us today, and the working group members. It's been absolutely extraordinary journey. Thank you so much for your input and generosity and time and fantastic discussions we had throughout these last 2 years. Obviously, our partners, great to see the Herbert and also Wolverhampton joining us today here, and we hope somehow we can continue the conversations and that you also benefited somehow from this experience. The team at UAL, especially Gabriele Grigorievite and Evelina Warner, that helped organize this event. And finally, two people I wanted to mention. Well, obviously, Anjalie, thank you so much, as I said before, for your generous reading of the publication, very insightful also questions and directions for further research. I wanted to thank my dear colleague, Paul Goodwin. It's been fantastic. Thank you for the camaraderie, for the empathy and support throughout. It was really, really enlightening and definitely a learning curve for me. And finally, to my colleague from Coventry University, Kausar Hussain. Kausar is a fantastic individual. Kausar is responsible for the service team to deliver this project together with me and Paul, but in addition is an inspiring individual, and I wanted to thank her for her support and companion in this journey. So I think it's all for me. Paul, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, just to say that I think Carol Thompson from Wolverhampton wanted to ask a question, but unfortunately I can't see. I can't see any hand.
Can you hear me? I think I've been
Yes.
unmuted.
Yes.
No, it was really just to clarify that I'm not the director at Wolverhampton, and that I exert influence as much as I can, and I fully take on board what's been said about the comparison with Blue Coat, and I totally agree with what Marlene said, and a lot of it is about that sort of continuity. So it's been fascinating, really interesting discussion, and yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks everyone, Anjalie, Ian, Marlene, and everyone. Also, of course, Carolina and I completely agree. It's been a great journey, and I hope that we continue it seems like the next direction is to take on the directors. So here we go. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
See everyone soon. Take care.